Different by design. Studebaker is. Studebaker is. Studebaker is.
Well, hello everybody, and I will be back next week at the Bootleggers Bash. I'm going to talk about the Measle Brewing Company during Prohibition. So if you like what I have to say today, you should definitely come back to Bootleggers Bash. And if you don't like what I have to say today, you should know that coming to see me at Bootleggers Bash is an optional part of the program. So today we're going to talk about the South Bend Toy Company. This is one of my favorite local businesses to talk about because it's a company that has a really old history, as we'll find out in a few minutes. But it's got a recent enough history that a lot of people in this room remember the company, might know someone who worked there. Did anyone ever work there? All right. Wow, I'm intimidated now. I better get this right, you know. How many of you, by show of hands, have a South Bend Toy Company product at your home somewhere? All right, keep your hands up, keep your hands up. How many of you had a South Bend Toy Company product, either a long time ago when you were a kid, something like that? All right, you can put your hands down now. So we're gonna have a lot of fun reminiscing, going down memory lane, and learning a fascinating history that deserves to be told. And our story is going to start in May of 1861. It's just a few weeks after the Confederates have opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, marking the beginning of the Civil War. Already by May of 1861, 7 states have seceded from the Union, and by the end of May 1861, 2 more are going to join them. The nation is divided. You guys have heard about this event, right? Okay, good. The nation is divided against itself and it's threatening to implode. Soldiers from the north are marching towards soldiers from the south, where they'll meet in bloody battlefields spanning hundreds of miles and hundreds of thousands of deaths. It's a scary time to be an American. It's a poor place to start a story about a toy company. But the cold, hard realities of war, that's all anyone should be thinking about in May of 1861. And if you open a newspaper from Boston, Massachusetts, you're going to be surprised to find that they're devoting a lot of column inches to something else. A new sport has come to America. It has taken over Massachusetts. And the summer of 1861 in Boston will be remembered equally as being the start of the Civil War and as the time when New England discovered croquet. By September in Boston, newspapers were reporting on croquet matches, the same way that they might report on a baseball game or a football game today. It wasn't just a game to them, it was a sport. They called the game the rage of the summer throughout Boston, and it spread like wildfire throughout the East Coast. It took 5 years before croquet came to Indiana. By the time the Civil War ended, croquet was on its way to St. Joseph County. 1 year in 1866, 1 year after South Bend celebrated its first birthday as an incorporated city, the first mention of croquet appeared in the local newspapers. Croquet mania was about to sweep over the entire state. Croquet clubs and teams appeared throughout South Bend, and the St. Joseph Valley Register even penned a poetic ode to the sport in 1869. And if you have ever seen me speak anywhere before, you know that one of my favorite things in the world is sharing bad poetry. So, without further ado, I would like to share with you a poem that ran in the St. Joseph Valley Register about croquet in 1869. A painter must that poet be, and lay with brightest hues his palette, who'd be the bard of croquet-ree, and sing the joys of hoop and mallet, Given all these, and I proclaim, be fortune friendly or capricious, when you win or lose the game, you'll find that croquet is delicious. I warned you. Anyway, besides inspiring bad poetry, croquet also inspired several intermarital assaults. Like when a woman in Clayton, Indiana, clubbed her husband over the head with a croquet mallet because she was frustrated with his poor play. Or when another woman in Boonville, Indiana, clubbed her fiancé over the head with a croquet mallet because she was frustrated with his poor play, putting him into the hospital with what was called a brain fever. Just so you know, the Boonville couple were wed as soon as the man recovered. Croquet was a sport that stirred passions, violent passions apparently, and maybe that's the moment when a pair of business-minded South Benders recognized that there was money to be made off of the craze. In 1874, with croquet still thriving in South Bend and across Indiana, a woodworker named John Teal and an entrepreneur named Frederick Badett went into the wood-turning business together. They couldn't have known it at the time, but during the next 100 years, their firm would produce more than 10 million croquet sets, more than any other company in the United States. Now, in 1874, their firm didn't even have a proper name yet, but it would soon enough, and when they got around to it, they were going to call it the South Bend Toy Manufacturing Company. John Teal, the woodworker of the operation, was a very, very skilled carpenter. He was a wood turner. Now, has anyone in here ever turned wood before? All right, a few people. Anyone who's ever turned wood knows that turning wood is very difficult, very labor-intensive, and really incredibly dangerous. With the technology of the 1870s, it was all of those things and even more so. John Teal had been in the wood-turning business with a fellow called Slick since 1871, but at some point he realized that it didn't seem like a good idea to open a business arrangement with a guy who called himself Slick. So on October 19, 1874, he dissolved that partnership and went into business with Frederick Badett. The two leased a small space on the East Race at the Huey Chair Factory. And if the oft-repeated legend is to be believed, they had a workplace that measured just 15 square feet. Now, 15 square feet is not a lot. That's like me lying down on the floor next to me again. I think that it is far more likely that the early writers of the newspapers meant to say that it was 15 feet by 15 feet, which would make it like 225 square feet. But that's not what they said. They said it was 15 square feet. So in this tiny half a hallway, they brought in lots of woodworking equipment, and the two of them somehow, and they set to work as wood turners. Besides making croquet sets, they made a lot of other things that you would expect a wood turner to make. They made chair legs, table legs, stairway banisters, and miscellaneous parts as needed for the South Bend Waterworks. They made wooden dumbbells and wooden Indian clubs, which were an old piece of exercise equipment that is kind of like a modern-day kettlebell. The only common denominator in their early product lines was that they made things from hard wood that could be turned and treated in their tiny shop. And this is the first really important point that I want to convey to you about the South Bend Toy Manufacturing Company, which is that Teal and Badett never, ever started out with the plan to start a toy company. They just made things that needed to be turned by a skilled woodman. That was their goal. That was the only common denominator. And it just so happens that croquet has lots of parts that need to be turned. The croquet handle needs to be turned, the mallet head needs to be turned, the ball needs to be turned. So they were turning wood, and all of a sudden there was this market for this new sport that required a lot of their services, so they jumped in. By the end of their first year in business, Teal and Badett had generated $7,000 in sales, which is almost $200,000 in today's money. That's a significant sum for a startup. They had 7 employees, and again, if you believe the legend, exactly 15 square feet for those employees to work out of. That's probably why they opened a separate paint and varnish shop at Taylor and Division Streets in 1875. And then in 1876, they moved their entire operation to a much larger space inside the South Bend Furniture Factory building. An 1877 South Bend Tribune article recounted the success of the firm, noting that croquet was at this point in time the most popular game on the continent, noting that it was of peculiar delight to youthful couples, and this is what the newspaper said about those youthful couples playing croquet. They love each other, all the way from puppy love to distraction, and they play croquet together because they haven't yet owned the fact to each other except through the medium of soulful glances. A season of croquet together is almost certain to bring matters to a focus and prepare the way to forge the links that only death or a divorce lawyer can sever. So apparently, besides wood turners, Teal and Badett were matchmakers. The article also is fascinating because it talks about the process of making those croquet sets. They used ash wood for the handle, apple tree wood for the heads of the mallets, and maple wood for the balls. Teal and Badett were very fortunate to be in South Bend in 1877 with nearby access to plenty of hardwood trees in a city with a healthy manufacturing ethos and railroads that connected it to everywhere else on the continent. At the same time, they still considered themselves first and foremost a wood-turning operation, not yet a toy company, and that year they made broom handles and table legs besides the croquet sets. But they made most of their money on the croquet sets. Their business grew like crazy. They sold 3,500 sets in 1875, 7,000 sets a year later, 15,000 in 1877, 20,000 in 1878, 40,000 in 1879, 75,000 in 1880. In 6 years, they had increased their croquet set sales by a factor of 20, and that is when they decided to stop making table legs. Of course, that didn't mean they were only making croquet sets, and that was a good business decision too. Just 2 years after the Tribune called croquet the biggest sport on the continent, it had been supplanted by another, newer, trendier sport. Fortunately for the partnership of Teal and Badett, the hot new sport was one that was going to require an awful lot of wood turning. Does anyone know what that new sport was? Baseball. Teal and Badett were about to make a fortune selling baseball bats. By 1879, they were the largest manufacturer of croquet sets in the country and the largest manufacturer of baseball bats in the world. If there was a larger one out there, I couldn't find it, and Louisville Slugger wouldn't get started for another 5 years. Kyle, I told you earlier that I would let you know what I want to see more than anything else in the world, and it is a South Bend, well, it wasn't a toy manufacturing company yet, a Teal and Badett baseball bat. You'll see what we could do. All right. Now, if any of you want to go home and look for these old baseball bats, I have to give you a warning. We do not believe that they stamped their bats, which means that a Teal and Badett baseball bat probably looks like a plain baseball bat. which means there's no way to know if you have a teal and batted baseball bat unless it is in a box with a sales receipt from the year 1879. It seems like a long shot. By 1880, they had been in business 5 years, but they were on top of the world, selling 50,000 baseball bats, 75,000 croquet sets, running a staff of 50 employees, and signing a deal with Studebaker to make children's wagons and carts that would carry the Studebaker name. By the end of 1882, they would be the largest manufacturer of croquet sets, baseball bats, and children's wagons on the entire planet. This is about when they made up their minds to become a full-on toy company, incorporating as the South Bend Toy Manufacturing Company on January 3rd, 1883, and taking on a guy called Will Carskadden as a third partner. They launched a new product in 1886 called the Dollar Wagon, which sounds to us like a bargain, but becomes less so when adjusted for inflation. The Dollar Wagon was so well made that it is not impossible to find one out in the wild. And when you do, sometimes they're actually in pretty good shape. Anyway, the new South Bend Toy Manufacturing Company quickly established itself as a major player in the city of South Bend and did all of the things that other major South Bend businesses did in the 1880s, like starting a company baseball team and watching its factory burn to the ground. We'll start with baseball. It's more fun. The baseball teams of South Bend's industrial leagues were legendary in the 1930s and 1940s. They often stole the front pages of the sports section away from the goings-on in the American and National Leagues. But those teams had roots all the way back in the 1880s, during a time when baseball looked a lot different than it does now or than it did in the 1930s. Pitchers still threw underhand. Gloves were barely mittens if they were worn at all. They did have wood baseball bats, and in 1887, those bats were most likely provided by the South Bend Toy Company. For the next 60 years, from 1880 to 1940, and if you have a newspapers.com subscription, this is kind of a fun thing to look up. If you type in South Bend Toy Company from 1880 to 1940, they show up far more often as a baseball team than as a South Bend company. Except on December 29th, 1887. That's when they showed up as a company, because that's when their factory burned to the ground. The Tribune took care to note that the South Bend Toy Company, as a toy manufacturer, was bigger than its next two competitors combined. But the Flames did not respect or care for the company's market share. I'm going to tell you how this fire started. I'm just going to read it straight from the newspaper. The fire was started by a careless employee named Chris Louser. Is that anyone's dad or grandpa? By the way, because... All right, good. Anyway, what this Chris Louser did was he placed a rag saturated with turpentine on a shovel and then thrust it into a stove. Then, repelled by the intense heat, he jerked it out and threw it blazing furiously among the flammable material in the wheel room. I do not know why he did any of these things, but given that the toy company was an outfit that worked primarily in both wood and lacquer, you can imagine the place went up in a hurry. The firefighters did everything they could, which wasn't much. The building was totaled in just a few hours. Now, at this point in time, the South Bend Toy Manufacturing Company had a difficult decision to make. It had already purchased land for a new, larger factory at 1012 High Street that was supposed to open 9 months later. And they had discussions about whether it made more sense to just shut down operations until the new facility was complete, or try to hastily rebuild their torched facility to return to production as quickly as possible. They chose the second option, rebuilding their burnt building while the new building was being built, and operating out of the shell of that burnt building for half a year before they moved to the High Street building. It was not a moment too soon. By 1889, South Bend Toy was receiving orders for wagons from individual purchasers, 100,000 at a time. And Clem Studebaker declared it to be the largest toy manufacturer in the world. I've looked into it, and while I can't definitively prove that statement to be true, I can't find anything that would prove it to be false. If South Bend wasn't the capital of the toy building world in 1889, it was certainly one of them, and it was about to get even bigger. During the 1890s, South Bend Toy was no longer among the leaders in baseball bats, but it would ship more than 1 million croquet sets during the decade. It maintained its dominance as the largest producer of children's wagons, and when it started making doll carriages, it rocketed to the top of that category as well. Business increased year over year during the 1890s and into the 1900s. There was not a lot of ingenuity in their product line during those years, but there didn't need to be, because the population of the United States was growing and the birth rate was through the roof. The market for children's toys was exploding, and wouldn't you know it, the sport of croquet was starting to experience a resurgence too. South Bend toy manufacturing in the early 1900s experienced record sales years, one year after another, after another, after another. In 1911, their toys were advertised in a 90-page catalog. Several models of croquet sets, plenty of children's wagons and doll carriages, a whole line of juvenile furniture that was perfect for kids' rooms and elementary school classrooms. In 1914, John Teal, the woodworker who started the whole thing, retired from the company, still considered the largest toy maker in the world. He sold his share of the company to Babbitt, and Teal would die a year later. As for Babbitt, he looked optimistically toward the many years to come, even as the First World War began to brew in Europe. Babbitt expected the war years to be really good for his company, rationalizing that since Germany produced more toys than any country in the world, there would be a growing market for non-German toys. He might have been right about that part, but he underestimated the way that World War I would wreck the local economy. South Bend Toy stayed afloat, they did okay, but it didn't break records. Could have been much worse though. When the wartime fuel shortage forced the closure of factories across the nation, the energy commissioners ordered 270 of St. Joseph County's 275 factories to close. Only 5 factories in the county were permitted to remain open, and South Bend Toy was one of them, on the basis that children's toys were absolutely necessary to maintain the nation's morale. South Bend Toy even experienced a national shift in attitudes toward children, toys, and especially Christmas shopping. Even Santa got in on promotion of the firm, and the Tribune noted that South Bend Toy filled a pretty big subscription for Old St. Nick, including gay little stick horses, coaster wagons, rocking horses, roller coasters, doll carriages, miniature farm wagons, wheelbarrows, carts, chairs, tables, cedar chests, shoe fly rockers, and shoot the chutes. By this time, more than anything else, they were known for those doll carriages, which I thought I had pictures of. South Bend Toy continued to grow, and when the South Bend Chilled Plow Company, not to be confused with the Oliver Plow Works, when the South Bend Chilled Plow was bought out by an Evansville company in 1925, South Bend Toy took that factory over too. In 1926, South Bend Toy Company also had a company basketball team, dropping what must have been a thrilling contest to the Bendix team by a score of 10-9. In 1936, the South Bend Toy baseball squad experienced one of the greatest moments in South Bend's long and storied baseball history when Louis Kraska hurled 9 innings of no-hit ball against a stacked Oliver team. In news about the company and not just its athletic ventures, South Bend Toy experienced a painful strike that shuttered the factory for... Oh, here's those doll pictures. We'll come. We'll get to what we're looking at. Some of you might recognize that one. Oh, okay, we'll get to all those. All right. My apologies. In 1940, Frederick Badett retired from the company after more than 60 years at the helm. For the first time in its history, the firm would have a new man in its president's chair. A guy named Frank Chrisman took over for Badett during what would become the most challenging years in the company's history, maybe the most challenging years in the history of human civilization. World War II was about to start. South Bend Toy was going to need to adapt to a wartime economy all over again after the attack at Pearl Harbor. The first year of Frank Chrisman's tenure as president of the South Bend Toy Manufacturing Company started on a strange note when he announced on April 3rd that the company would begin making that beloved children's plaything, laundry hampers. The year ended on a somber note when the War Department contracted his company to produce $39,000 worth of tent poles. During the coming years, South Bend Toy would be brought further into the war effort, harnessing its long pedigree as a master wood-turning facility and being called to produce billy clubs for military police on bases across the nation. But just like it had been during World War I, the primary work of South Bend Toy was protected. The administration declared that doll carriages were absolutely essential, once again, to the morale of the nation. In 1942, Chrisman announced that production at South Bend Toy was 50-50 between wartime goods and toys. It was also during this time that the toy company became the most dangerous place in South Bend to work. Remember how I mentioned earlier that wood turning was very, very dangerous? Now I want you to imagine during World War II, when technology still isn't really there yet, and you're bringing in lots of inexperienced and untrained employees to make up for the workers who had gone off to war. During these years, South Bend Toy probably seemed like a battlefield. Rosie the Riveter might have thrived in Detroit, but at South Bend Toy, she lacerated a kidney. South Bend Toy employees were immolated, mutilated. These are all words directly from the newspaper, by the way. Immolated, mutilated, crushed, burned, dismembered, and blinded. They plummeted down elevator shafts. They sliced tendons. They lost fingers. They punctured lungs and were maimed by the exploding shrapnel of failing equipment pushed past its limit. My favorite account tells of a man who took a timber kickback to the crotch. The newspaper describes how he waddled home holding his private parts and that no one in town saw him come out of his house for the next 5 days. All of this was reported regularly in the newspapers, and all of it was the result of unseasoned employees working beyond their expertise on equipment pushed beyond its lifetime in support of a war that needed to be won. Things calmed down at the end of the war, and so far as I can tell, for all of the injuries at the toy company, no one ever died. By 1950, Chrisman had seen the company through a transition and a war, a term of 10 years that must have seemed like 20. He announced his retirement and was replaced by Badett's son, who would himself only serve a term of 2 years before being replaced by Robert Measle in 1952. By 1952, South Bend Toys' catalog hadn't changed. It made doll buggies, kids' furniture, and croquet sets. The newspaper only called them one of the largest toy manufacturers in the world, but South Bend Toy would claim record sales years for each of the next 8 years. By the end of the 1950s, they had offices in Los Angeles, Seattle, Nashville, Toronto, and a shiny flagship office on Fifth Avenue in New York City. Its CEO, Robert Miesel, was named president of the Toy Manufacturers of the United States of America. After nearly 80 years, it might have seemed that South Bend Toy was still on top of the world, but there was beginning to be cause for concern. In 1957, the Badditt family sold its shares of the company to Benjamin Foreman, a Chicago industrialist who would later liquidate the South Bend Bait Company, as well as a local tool and die shop. By 1959, Foreman had struck a deal to make South Bend Toy a division of Playskool. That didn't mean South Bend Toy was over. It kept its name, and it kept most of its products. In fact, South Bend Toy, while a subsidiary of Playskool, went on to acquire a pair of companies for its own, a place called Keystone Wood Toys out of New Jersey, and Lou Erbach Incorporated, a manufacturer of pools and skating rinks. All of it was a feather in the cap of Robert Miesel, who went out on top after another record year and handed the reins of the company over to Louis Christ, a longtime employee of the company and the best tennis player in South Bend. Christ oversaw did anyone know him? All right, okay, now we're getting into a version of history that you're going to recognize and correct me on. Christ oversaw South Bend Toy in 1960. It was the first year in 8 that did not deliver new sales records. He managed the company through an economic slowdown, but by 1965, they were back on their feet again, breaking sales records year after year after year. When Milton Bradley bought out Playskool in 1968, it didn't even register as a blip at the South Bend Toy Company. They broke a record that year and in the next one. In 1970, so not really that long ago, they shipped more than 90 million toys. In 1972, they won the Sears and Roebuck Symbol of Excellence Award as the highest quality toy maker in the world. That same year, the city of South Bend sold $1.6 million in bonds to help the South Bend Toy Company remodel and relocate to a new facility at 3300 West Sample Street. It moved into the new building on September 10th, 1973. And it won its second Sears Award. A year after that, South Bend Toy celebrated its 100th anniversary and won the Sears Award for a third time. A year after that, they launched a TV show called Celebrity Tennis. Has anyone ever seen this show? I have yet to meet anyone who's ever seen this show. It was a marketing scheme. They had a new lawn tennis game they were trying to sell, so they started this celebrity tennis game, and it included stars like Robert Stack, Lloyd Bridges, and Bob Newhart. That same year, they also won their 4th consecutive Sears Award. In 1976, Christ retired, but South Bend Toy won its 5th Sears Award. In 1977, it won its 6th. In 1978, the High Street facility finally came down. But the future looked bright at the new Sample Street building. 1978 was the year South Bend Toy won its 7th Sears and Roebuck Excellence Award in a row and a new sales record. Now, I don't mean to spoil the ending of this for you, but by the end of 1978, South Bend Toy had experienced record profits for 9 of its past 12 years, and it had won that Sears and Roebuck Award, the highest honor in their field, each of the previous 7 years. And it was just 3 years from going out of business. Cheaper competition from overseas had been a disaster for a lot of the businesses of South Bend. It was even worse for South Bend Toy, a company that had always competed on quality and not so much on price. The children's toy market was flooded with new tech and new fads. And the problem with tech toys is that you don't need a high-tech device to be long-lasting when its technology will be outdated in a year or two anyway. The toy industry was no longer about building durable wagons that would last for generations. It was about finding a shiny thing and making as much money off of it as you could before the next shiny thing came along to replace it. South Bend Toy tried to play that game for a little bit, winning a contract to produce Star Trek toys around the release of the first Star Trek movie in 1979. But it was too late. Rumors about closing the factory began in 1980, but were forestalled by layoffs and reorganizations. By the end of 1981, they realized there wasn't much they could do. At that point, South Bend Toys' workforce was down to 125, and in December, the factory was closed, and most of those 125 were out of jobs. But not quite all of them. Before the company was completely parted out, South Bend Toys general manager John Bycraft bought out the firm's croquet line, the endeavor that started it all, and South Bend Toys' most enduring legacy. Even as the company had declined, it remained, as it always had been, the largest maker of croquet sets in the United States. Bycraft started a new company. This one was called South Bend Toy Incorporated. He built the new venture entirely around the manufacture of croquet sets. It was a terrible idea. During the 1980s, the popularity of croquet was eclipsed by literally every other sport. No one really wanted to buy croquet sets, and if they did, guess what? The secondary market was saturated with millions of South Bend Toy croquet sets that were so well made that they were practically as good as new, even if they were 40 or 50 years old. Even today, if you go to eBay and search for a South Bend Toy croquet set, you can find a croquet set that's 70, 80 years old, and it's just relatively affordable. There are still a lot of them out there. They were very, very well made. On June 19th, 1985, South Bend Toy Incorporated announced it would cease its operations. South Bend Toy Manufacturing Company occupied many buildings during the years, but its facilities at Huey Chair, South Bend Furniture Company, and on High Street have all been razed. Facility at 3300 Sample is still there, and it is home to the South Bend Chocolate Company factory. To this day, you can look for South Bend Toy products on Google or eBay, and you'll find a glut of high-quality, long-lasting toys from the outfit that were once the largest toy maker in the world, at least according to Clem Studebaker. Thank you so much for having me. I hope you've enjoyed this, and we have time for a few questions. All right.
Different by design. Studebaker is. Studebaker is. Studebaker is.